Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming out. My name is Alex Ellerbeck. I'm the North America Program Coordinator at the Global Press Freedom Organization Committee to Protect Journalists. And we're going to talk today about the press freedom crisis in Mexico. It's the deadliest country in the Western Hemisphere for journalists. And we've got three incredible panelists here to talk with us today. Emmanuel Guillen is an independent photojournalist based in New York. He has an exhibit here at Photoville in container number 7, which you guys should all take a chance to look at. He documents human rights abuses, the violence, the impact of violence and the drug war in Mexico, and social issues. We have Alejandra Ibarra Chaoul, a bilingual investigative journalist, also based in New York. She is currently working at the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, building an archive of the work of Mexican journalists who have been killed for their work, collecting the circumstances of their murders as well as a history of what they've been working on. She was also selected as one of 10 promising young writers in Mexico for Bolas y Baladas, and was a finalist of Nuevas Plumas for her an international magazine writing competition. And on the far left, we have Ginger Thompson, a senior reporter at ProPublica. She was also the Mexico City bureau chief for both the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun. She has a very long list of awards and accolades, including a Pulitzer, the Maria Morris Cabot Prize, the Selden Ring Award for Investigative Reporting, the Inter-American Press Association Award, the Overseas Press Club Award, and I'm sure there are many others. So thank you all for being here. And I'd like to start with Emmanuel, and I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about your exhibit. You document, you've given it a very bleak title, Blackness, and you document some pretty chilling things. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what led you to look at the impact of the war on drugs in Mexico and what you want this audience to take away from your exhibit.
So thank you so much, Alex, and thank you everyone for being here today. So yeah, I'm exhibiting a few pictures here in the container number 7 with the Bronx Documentary Center. We are presenting the work of 3 photographers. It's Mauricio Palos, it's a video right in the back. Felix Marquez, who documents the belongings of some of the journalists that have been killed in his home state in Veracruz. Mauricio Palos focuses in following some journalists across Mexico to show how they work, under which kind of circumstances. And my work are just a series of black and white pictures that kind of try to explore different parts in the country with different scenarios, going from the, following groups of sicarios until the kind of landscapes that can be seen in these places by being interrupted for violence or containing the violence itself. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it, and I hope you can get a sense of what it is by the combination that it's in the container, because I think it's a pretty good combination, because my work, for example, tries to show the environment itself and how violent it could be. Mauricio's work follows the journalists as they go and try to document what's going on. And Felix's focuses on the aftermath of how it is to cover those areas and how it is like the aftermath of what happened to those who tried to tell the truth and to tell these stories in these places. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. Alejandra, you've delved into press freedom in Mexico from a couple of different angles, both looking at the factors that can lead to journalists being murdered, issues around impunity or cases that have gone unsolved, and now working on this database of journalists' work. Can you give us a sense of the scope of the press freedom threat in Mexico and some of the findings of your research?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to talk here and for everyone to be here as well. Mexico is a very peculiar case regarding press freedom because it became very violent as it transitioned into democracy in 2000. And I've done some work trying to explore what shapes the factors that turn out into violence against journalists. Because it's not only the fact that there's a general context of violence and the drug war, it's also a lot to do with corruption and lack of accountability from different levels of government. So I've been trying to look into that, and it's really strange, Mexico, because Mexico is, as Alex said, the most dangerous country for reporters in the Western Hemisphere. And worldwide, it can only be compared to countries like Iraq and Syria, which are in very different conditions from Mexico's condition right now. And as opposed to other countries where reporters die in like conflict zones or as a result of crossfire, in Mexico's journalists are targeted and they're silenced for their work. It's not as if they died when other criminal groups were shooting at each other. They come for them when they're driving their kids to school, when they are eating dinner out at a restaurant, so it's very targeted.
Ginger, I was wondering, you worked in Mexico for more than a decade and worked as a bureau chief. Can you talk about some of the challenges you faced running a bureau in Mexico City, and also what, amidst this general panorama of violence both against journalists as well as against citizens throughout Mexico, what kind of stories did you look to find for an American and international audience?
So I should say, when I was in Mexico for the Times, it had just elected its first non-ruling party president. They considered him, Vicente Fox, the first democratically elected president in Mexico. And we focused very heavily on, writing about him and his sort of fight to kind of establish independent institutions, particularly institutions that have to do with justice. And it was a losing battle. The corruption in Mexico runs so deep and has been going on for so long. And Vicente Fox, it was much bigger than him, and he was not really successful. A lot of things happened, including 9/11, which really derailed U.S. interest in Mexico. And so Vicente Fox suddenly didn't have international support that he needed to push political forces in Mexico in a certain direction. The violence, though, didn't really explode this way until after I had left Mexico and Felipe Calderón was elected as president. And so when I was in Mexico, I was writing a lot about democratic transitions or lack of democratic transitions. I was writing a lot about immigration. I didn't start covering the drug war until I left Mexico in 2006, and I was in the Washington Bureau. And my focus on the drug war has been to sort of try to write about the US role in Mexico's drug war, because I think a lot of times we in the United States think that this is Mexico's problem, that the violence is Mexico's problem. And there's there's a lot of good reason for that. A lot of the problems have to do with Mexico's lack of institutions and the corruption that runs deep there. But the United States plays a really big role in Mexico and in its drug war. And in fact, when Felipe Calderón started the drug war, he started it with great support from the United States that wanted to go after Mexican kingpins. And it was called the Kingpin Strategy. And that strategy has been ruinous for Mexico. And so while the United States, pushed Felipe Calderón, who had his own political reasons at home for wanting to win public support, he had won the presidency with a very slim margin of support. And he thought that the drug war, with the US support, would help sort of galvanize support in his favor. So he basically started this war with the US's support and encouragement and money, and foisted this fight on institutions that weren't quite prepared to protect civil society from the consequences, right? So you're sort of running around arresting kingpins and disrupting criminal organizations, but there aren't courts and there aren't police forces that really sort of protect civil society from the fights between these drug traffickers that happen as a result of these big arrests. So a lot of my work has been trying to talk about sort of what role we play there, a role which is often kept secret because Mexico doesn't want its people to know that our police and our FBI and our DEA are operating in Mexican territory, and the Mexican government wants to keep it secret as well for those same reasons. And so where there are secrets, there are reporters. And so that's what I've been doing.
Emmanuel, this is actually something that you touch on in your exhibit. And you draw the legacy from the beginning of the drug war under Calderón in 2006 to the current administration, which is outgoing in December, of Peña Nieto. Could you sort of give us a rough timeline of what's happened over the past decade?
So yeah, as Ginger said, Mexico used to be a really different country like 12 years ago. It was, it wasn't the best place on earth, but it was a nice place to live in. And living here in the city for over a year, I have discovered how different it is, or it was, how different my country was when most of my paisanos, my fellow Mexicans here, left the country, because they left at a moment when the violence was not a protagonist in Mexico's life. So the strategy of the drug war itself has failed in terms of, the whole point was to, defeat the cartels, fight them and defeat them. That was the whole point. So it's really easy to say that it failed because now we got more cartels. They are armed to the teeth. And there is more people in their ranks because the market in the US and the demand in Mexico and the places, even the places where they can cultivate the drugs or where they can develop synthetic drugs changed because of the drug war itself. Back in the days, the only narco states used to be places like Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and pretty much all the north. But there were other places that were kind of a sanctuary of peace. And I can certainly tell you guys that there is not a single place in Mexico right now that is peaceful, not even Mexico City. And the thing is that from Felipe Calderón's war, it went all the way until Peña Nieto took power in 2012. And the Peña Nieto's administration decided to not change the strategy. And that was a major mistake, or I will say a conscious decision, because everybody knew what was happening in Mexico. Just for instance, in the highest moment of violence in Mexico during Calderón's administration, the average of people killed per day was 50. That was the average per day. And I think it was right in the middle of the Peña Nieto's administration when the average reached 70 people per day. And this couple of months, this year and the last, the rate got up to 90 people per day. So now it's how it is at its worst. And nobody's talking about what's going on there, even when it's, it's just worse than it used to be when it was a highlight, when it was being highlighted in the news. The particularity in this strategy is that Mexico, it's been using its armed forces, such as the Army, the Navy, the Federal Police, which is a militarized police. And now when you go to places that used to be really touristic kind of place in Mexico, like such as Acapulco, or even now Cancun, that it's kind of the only place that a lot of people here know. And it has been spreading all the way to Mexico City, when now we have like corpses and heads in Insurgentes Avenue. We got the army in the street. And the thing is, for me, what failed from Felipe Calderón's to Peña Nieto, and hopefully it's going to be different now with the new administration, hopefully, we'll still see soon, is that there was not a diagnostic of what was happening in my country. There was not a diagnostic of who is or who are these people in the cartels that we're going to fight against. There was not an economic study of what was going on. And the only way they decided to fight the cartels in Mexico was through weapons and bullets, and that was it. So over the years, 1 month, each month has been like beating the previous month rate or record of its deadly record. So now we got, I think the figures are around 234,000 people that have been killed. And that's the official number. So it might be, the real number might be really like way higher. We got around, I think it's reaching around 38,000 people who has been disappeared in Mexico, and that's already more than the Argentinian dictatorship. So now Mexico finds itself in a really particular moment after the elections, because it's the first time that Mexico decided to go to the left for its federal government. And it's been quite, it's been a whole debate, because one of the promises, or one of the things that Obrador is promoting is an amnesty law. So we still have to wait to see the results.
I think there's a lot to dive in with the election and what that means for Mexico. But before you get there, you mentioned something that I thought was very interesting, which is the idea that it's actually in some ways worse now than it was in 2006. And you said you thought there was less coverage of that internationally. And I'm interested, Ginger, do you find that to be the case? Do you find that there's less?
Yeah, I think the whole election went very uncovered in this country. I don't think, there were something like 102 or 3 candidates for government, politicians who were killed during this election season. And I don't think the Times, that I love and worked for, but didn't really write that story until like 2 or 3 days before the election. And so I think that, there's a lot of reasons for that, and they're not illegitimate reasons. This country is going through its own political upheaval, and there are lots of places in the world to cover. But I do think attention on Mexico has fallen, particularly, as we're talking about journalists and the fact that it's become the most dangerous place for journalists to work in this hemisphere. I think there's been some good work on that, but not nearly enough.
Alejandra, in this general environment where you have 234,000 people killed in Mexico, where does the issue of press freedom fit in? I mean, why is the press freedom crisis a crisis we should be focusing on amidst this general crisis of impunity and violence? And what is the role of reporters in Mexico?
The patterns of violence against journalists vary according to what kind of threat you're focusing on. But if we're talking about murdered journalists, the places where journalists are mostly murdered are similar to the states that are most violent, but they're not necessarily the same or at the same rate. So for example, the state with more journalists murdered is Veracruz with 22, but it's not the most murderous state in the country. And it's followed by Oaxaca and Guerrero with 12 each, Chihuahua with 10, and Tamaulipas with 8. So that's the general way it looks like. Veracruz is on the east coast. Two of the other states are on the border, and the other 2 are on the west southern coast. One of the interesting things that you mentioned was the impunity about these cases. And so what that means is that 99.7% of these crimes has not been solved. So we don't really know who is murdering these journalists. None of these cases have come to a conclusion where there's a guilty party in jail. And that makes calculating the risks of reporters very complicated, because if you don't know where the threat is coming from or where the attack is coming from, it becomes very complicated to assess when it's going to be real and when it's going to turn out in actual physical violence. Yeah.
And can I just add one point to that? I mean, killing a journalist and killing anyone is a horrible thing. But in Mexico, when journalists are killed, it's an attack on democracy. And it's a message to the rest of civil society. And that's why these killings are important, because they have a political intent, right, that is meant to sort of quiet this effort by, Mexican civil society to free itself from 70 or 80 years of, control by one political party, right? It's an attempt by civil society to really be free and to have freedom of expression. And so those killings are important in ways that other killings are not, I would argue.
Can I add a very small thing? I completely agree with you, Ginger. It's totally true that they provide that information for civil society for us Mexicans to make better decisions, to choose our governors, representatives. And without that link, not only journalists suffer, which they do directly, as do their families, but the whole society suffers from the lack of information and that lack of agency to exert change. Exactly. And to hold those accountable which are doing what they're doing.
And I would like to add just a few thoughts that I think in the case of journalists, not only the Mexican society and the rest of the world or whatever, there is a particular way to kill journalists in Mexico. It's you know, sometimes they get shot in the street and that kind of things. But there are also a bunch of cases of journalists being tortured before actually being killed and lose their lives. And there is a particular signature of violence in each case that pretends to send a message to the rest of the journalistic community, especially with the journalists that are covering stories in their hometowns. You know, for me, local journalists are the most vulnerable part of the whole community, because some of us go to the places, we are in the field doing things, but most of the time we can go back home and be a little bit safer. But those who live right in the place are the ones that are more in a pretty bad situation. So I just wanted to put that in the table.
What kinds of stories are not being covered? What kinds of stories do some journalists maybe shy away from because of the threat?
I think a lot of journalists in Mexico, their news organizations have completely decided not to write about violent crime. You know, they simply don't cover every murder because a lot of those murders are, you know, committed by drug organizations that have control of their local governments. And so not only do, you know, neighbors not report what they know about crimes, but reporters don't report what they know about crimes. And so, you know, I can't really blame them. I mean, you know, what Emmanuel was saying is these local journalists work at news organizations where they have almost no pay. These organizations run on advertising that comes from the government. So these are not, they are independent in many ways, but in the most fundamental of ways, they're not, because most Mexican news organizations rely on the government for advertising. That is where most of their money comes from. And so their editors are afraid to lose that financing, and so they don't want their reporters covering stories that are uncomfortable for the government. And the government is in league with these drug organizations in many cases, right? Especially at local levels. So where the federal government fails, the local governments are just non-existent in many places. I mean, I spent the last couple of years writing a story about a massacre in a town called Allende in Coahuila, where this massacre happened and dozens, possibly hundreds of people just vanished. And nobody talked about it for like months. People were afraid to say anything to the police because the police were involved, to the military because the military was involved, to the mayor because the mayor was involved. There was no one they could go to talk about this. And so reporters are the same. I met a lot of reporters in Coahuila who said, you know, I was there when Allende happened, and we couldn't report it. We weren't allowed to report it. So it, you know, this is real, and reporters who do get killed. And they don't just get killed, it's like Emmanuel was saying, they get killed in front of their kids. You know, there's like gunmen coming into a reporter's school where his kid is going to school and shoots him dead in front of a classroom of children. That's how reporters get killed. Or, you know, a mother driving her kid to school is ambushed in a car. That's how reporters get killed. So they are sending messages to other reporters, they're sending messages to civil society that if we can kill her, you know, this very public news person, right? If she has no protection, you don't either, right? And that's why this is so insidious, and that's why this is so important.
So yeah, I mean, there are cases like Allende, and just for instance, it was a town where Los Zetas cartel killed probably more than 300 people, and their remains were dissolved in acid. So there are no corpses, and nobody reported about it. Nobody talked about it. until I saw ProPublica publishing along, I think, with
I mean,
National
there were
Geographic.
stories before ProPublica's story, don't get me wrong. It's just that immediately after this major event happened, there was nothing.
And there are a lot of agendas in going on in Mexico, but they can't be covered because no one is going to go there right when it's happening, of course. And it might be a really bad decision for journalists, especially for those who work for like local organizations, local newspapers, to report on it, because that's a death sentence for sure. And sometimes, I mean, in places like Mexico, you don't need to be a high-profile journalist to catch the attention of I don't know, the government, the cartels, or whatever. You just need to piss somebody off, and that's going to be enough for you to lose your life.
Emmanuel, Alejandra mentioned something interesting about how difficult it was to calculate risk, and how difficult it is sometimes to know where a threat is coming from. You've had some of your own experiences navigating risk in your reporting. Could you talk a little bit about what measures you take and how you navigate that?
So, as Alejandra said, it's really hard to calculate the risk in Mexico, not only because, you know, in some places in the world there are really clear sites, really clear areas that are like red zones or green zones where you can be a little bit safer. But Mexico is an entire red or black zone. So you can't know which person it's worth it to trust in. It might be a taxi driver who tells the cartels that you're in whatever street and you get killed because of that. It might be the halcones, who are people who are checking the streets and report to the cartels, who could say like, oh, there is a few reporters here. Probably that happened to them in agenda, and we will never know. The military, the army, and the Navy, and the police, the federal police, every single layer in Mexican society is involved in some level. So it's really difficult to navigate the cases. In my experience, which is probably a little bit short, I used to go to spend most of my vacations during college going to these places just because I wanted to, because I was curious about it. And I had no idea of what was trying to do. So probably that was pretty stupid. But somehow I learned how to navigate some of the places that I was going to. And at some point I started to get threats from the cartels when I was going there to take pictures, particularly, or doing some other stuff. And for me, I mean, you know that even if you start receiving threats from the cartels, you know that there might be a safe zone in terms of, as long as you don't go to their territories, as long as you don't mess with them again, it's probably going to be fine. Just probably, not in all cases. But in my case, the thing that scared me the most was after covering the case of the 43 students who disappeared in Mexico, in Ayotzinapa. It got published in a few places, even here in the New York Times Lens blog, in other places in Europe. And it got a little bit of attention. And at some point, the nature of the threats that I was getting, receiving through emails, through my phone, or phone calls or stuff like that, started to change the language itself. And at some point, you know, I used to Skype it with my girl, who's my wife now, who was living here in New York. We used to Skype every day, right? And at some point, we started to hear typing that was coming from somewhere, but not from none of us. There was like noises of somebody putting a glass of water on the table, or an environmental noise that wasn't from each of us. So at some point, you can certainly realize that these are not the cartels anymore. This is probably something else. And I went to Mexico City once, and they started to send me pictures of myself earlier in the day. For example, if they send me a picture of me, I don't know, like on the subway this morning. So I knew that was something different. Mm-hmm. So if you can notice the nature of the things changing, for me and for a lot of my colleagues, the government is more dangerous for some journalists, or in most of the cases, mm-hmm. than the cartels themselves sometimes. So I only, very quickly, I just want to say that for most of my colleagues, there is not a way to navigate those situations, especially when you live in there, mm-hmm. or even, organizations like Article 19 and the Committee to Protect Journalists have developed some protocols and, some advices to how to cover these conflicts. I personally think that there is no way for you to be prepared of how to react to those situations. You just got to be lucky enough and smart enough to know how to say or when to say, you know what, that's enough.
Can I jump in on that?
Mm-hmm.
I think that Emmanuel's case is very clear about the different threats, and I think he was very smart, and he was savvy enough and had traveled enough across the country to be able to tell the different kinds of threats and the different level of possibly like stretch or reach of each threat. And I think that really illustrates the difficulty in calculating them. And for a lot of journalists in Mexico, that's really hard because maybe they haven't traveled from state to state, or maybe they're not sure of how far the threat can go. Take the case of Ruben Espinosa, who lived in Veracruz, and he was receiving threats. He could tell that they had gotten to a point where he needed to leave. And he left. He fled from Veracruz to Mexico City, where he lived, and it wasn't enough. Like, he could tell there was a threat. He could tell it was a dangerous threat. He could tell it was an important threat enough to leave, and the place where he left wasn't enough. Or you can take cases like Maximino Rodriguez in Baja California Sur, where he had been receiving phone threats since 2016, continuous threats, and he stayed there reporting. 2017, threats continued, stayed there reporting. And 2 years later, in 2018, he was murdered. But calculate that during the previous 24 months.
When and where it's gonna happen, it's a really...
Yeah, when is it actually gonna tip off? And like, when is it gonna get physically violent? And there's cases like reporters, female reporters like Miroslava Brich or Regina Martinez, who covered corruption and crime. So it's really, in those cases, it's, I think, even harder to tell you're receiving threats, but where is it coming from? And who's worse?
Mm-hmm. The government often, the Mexican government often, when it talks about the press freedom crisis, talks about the general difficulty of dealing with organized crime. I'm interested in your thoughts on this sort of this excuse. How many of the threats are coming from organized crime? How many of the threats are coming from state actors? And is there really, I mean, how should we even think of the dichotomy between those two?
There's some data available, like Article 19 collects investigates the source of some of the attacks, most of them not the physical ones, like hacking attacks or telephone threats or cloning your website or things like this. And according to them, most of these attacks come from public servants. Having said that, I think that the source or the line that divides government from organized crime is way more unclear on a local level. Like the more local the government gets, like at a municipal level, it's, I think, gonna be way harder to determine which one is which, because sometimes they're the same. They're like literally the same. The same people, the same humans, So it doesn't really make a difference who's who or what hat they're wearing, because the threat is really coming from the same place. I think it gets more complicated as you elevate levels of government. So like when you're talking about the governor, then it gets trickier. When you're talking about the federal government, who like was, it's known that they spied on reporters and they like spied on them with malicious software, then, I mean, that's where the excuse gets harder, because it's not really believable that it's the organized crime, although they claim to say that it's for security purposes.
I think it's actually not all that hard. I think what's hard is to get people punished for those things.
Oh, yeah.
But there's been plenty of evidence, right, of collusion by high-level government officials at the federal, state, and local levels, but getting punishments for those people has been almost impossible. It is true at the local level they're like the same people. At the federal level there's maybe, you know, some degrees of separation, but the facts that the federal government has been using, has been hacking into reporters' computers and into their phones, and all of that has been proven, right? There's real evidence for that. What's really hard to get in Mexico are prosecutions. And until that changes, the rest of it is really going to be hard to change. And we can have a new president in López Obrador, and there's a lot of hopefulness around him. But unless he's interested in really changing institutions almost from the ground up, because that's how bad it is in Mexico, and that's not an easy thing. I mean, I'm not saying that what Mexico needs to do is easy. It's not. But, you know, a start might be prosecuting people in a serious way at high levels who are responsible for these, you know, very prominent attacks on the press or on political actors or whoever. But I think there's tons of evidence that the collusion is real.
I actually want to talk a little bit about this election. I mean, it's hard to overstate how big of a deal this election is in Mexico. I mean, it's a major shift. It's a major game changer. Left-leaning president López Obrador won the presidency, and his party Morena won the
whole Congress.
the Congress. Yeah. So what? I mean. And swept a lot of the local elections as well. So I mean, what does this mean? What are you optimistic that this could lead to a change? That he could tackle issues like impunity, the lack of prosecutions of crime?
I'm gonna choose to be optimistic. I think there's a lot on the table that can work for passing certain laws that are key to protecting journalists. So I think, as Alex mentioned, due to the results in the election, there's enough strength in Congress and in state congresses to pass laws. And there's a couple of laws, at least, that come to mind. One about internal security that was passed, which basically allows for surveillance against anything that seems like a threat, which could easily could mean reporters, if that's what they choose it is. So that could be changed. And the other one, as Ginger mentioned, is the law about public advertising, public publicity, advertising from the government, which is a very, I don't know if subtle, but it's an institutionalized way of exert power and dictate editorial lines. So that's another one that could be changed. There are, like, the numbers are there, it's just a matter of them doing it.
Political will.
But there's also been some concern raised potentially about the shift in government advertising. I don't know, Ginger, if you want to.
Because then, you know, so now news organizations are slashing their staffs in half, right? And so it's the reporters that are going to get cut in this whole thing. And there's some concerns that we finally have a president on the left, and we're going to have news organizations that are in disarray because we no longer have government funding for them. So it's like, it's a necessary evil, but there is a downside to this. And I think news organizations in Mexico are now going to scramble to try to figure out how to make up for this loss in funds if López Obrador really goes through with this. You know, in one way, I personally would think it's probably an important step that these news organizations are sort of allowed to be more independent and operate independently, which means they need to get independent funding and rely less on the government. But on the other hand, you know, there are going to be a lot of reporters out of jobs, and I certainly don't like that either. And you know, fewer reporters is not what Mexico really needs right now. It actually needs more, and so it's a complicated issue.
I think I agree with you, and I think that maybe not, the solution is not stopping the public funding, but delineating or like sketching out and being very precise about how to spend when and how much, because the opaque nature and the arbitrary nature of how much money the government spends on which publications whenever they want, it's what's really pernicious, I think.
So I want to leave some time for questions, but before we go to that, I wanted to ask each of you what the international community should be doing to help resolve the press freedom crisis in Mexico.
In a perfect world, I think in the use case specifically, since we're neighbors, I think what we will need is to get a little bit more of coverage, but like in a really thoughtful way, you know, putting on the table a lot of context of what's the role of the U.S. In Mexico's predicament, and also reporting like the major stories in here, in order to be able to engage with the audience, with the people, and eventually that might lead to maybe political action, or you know, at least some consciousness. That's all we need, you know. That's like the less we can aspire to. But I won't want to talk to.
I agree with you, but I would be a little bit more pragmatic. I would say my wish would be for funding. Like, expand your Mexico bureaus. Fund an independent investigative newsroom. There's really good reporting in Mexico. There's really good photojournalists in Mexico. Consume more of the stories, but also like put some money there so we can work on them.
I agree with both. I don't know that I would add any more solutions. I think accountability and looking for ways to hold bad actors accountable, you know, as the press and as citizens who have senators and congressmen who send money to Mexico, you know, urging them to pay attention to these issues, I think is important. You know, the one thing that we don't need, obviously, is a wall, right? And so I think, you know, in addition to what they've said, I think accountability, and I think, you know, looking for sort of ways to understand how interconnected we are and how their problems are not just their problems, that they're driven a lot of times by, you know, either funding or drug consumption or, you know,
selling weapons
from the United States, right? That we're in this together. And I think if there was more of a consciousness about that, it might go a long way.
So I want to give a chance for people in the audience to ask questions.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Hi, my name's Sarah Matheson. I'm a documentary photographer from Australia, but I'm based in Chicago. I've got a really practical question. When you're there and you're reporting like this, how do you physically stay safe?
Me?
Either of you.
So It really depends. I do a lot of reporting before I go into a place to try to figure out things as simple as, can I drive there, or are there checkpoints on the road? You know, do I need a driver? Can I go by myself into a place? I prefer to go alone into places because I can kind of move without a lot of attention. I don't have big cameras when I show up in a place, right? So it's me in a rental car and my notebooks. And I try to do that and sort of be quiet and try to identify a couple of people who I can go see as soon as I get there. And I try to establish as quickly as I can, like 2 or 3 people. I call them mis gente de confianza, my trusted sort of friends in town, who I then go into town and I call and say, I'm here today, I'm wandering around, and I'll call you at 6 when I'm going back to my hotel. So I sort of have someone to check in with. I check in with my husband, you know, I sort of make sure I call him regularly. But it's really doing a lot of work before I go into a place. You know, if there are reporters who have worked there, I talk to them, and then I try to find community types, you know, low level, quiet. You know, last time in Allende, my first real good contact was a beekeeper, right, who used to be like on the city council. And we got sort of an idea that he was someone who knew a lot, knew everybody in town. And once I connected with him, he kind of pointed me to people who were sort of safe to talk to. And then you kind of go in circles, right? You go that circle, then you get them to give you another circle. And so that's a long-winded way of, yeah.
So in my case, it's similar in terms of you gotta learn as much as you can of the places you're going to before going there. But having a camera is really different because it's like a magnet for trouble. And for example, I felt the curiosity to get in touch with the different sides of the story of what's going on in Mexico. So I have met with victims. I have met with former victims who formed even death squads to literally just search and kill the people who disappeared or killed their loved ones. I have met with cartel members and stuff like that. Sometimes with previous agreement, sometimes randomly, walking in the Sierra somewhere. For example, I learned that the more comfortable you can make them, the safer you are. When I talk to them, I don't talk in the same way that I talk with my friends or with my family. You gotta use the language that they use to communicate in the best possible way, so they could feel you like not that like a certain kind of alienation. So if you speak their local language, if you use their words, if you have no idea of how many narco corridos I've learned over the years in order to sing with them, sometimes just to pretend I was cool. I was like, oh, yeah, let's sing. So, and that allowed me to establish a link between me and them in order for them not to kill me. And that's pretty much it. And there is no way for you to escape from some extra dangers once in a while, but that's pretty much the dynamic. There.
Hi, this is kind of a similar question, a kind of follow-up to what was just asked, but do you or any other journalists have you guys taken measures to kind of protect or hide your identities, either in the field or after your work has been published, and how would people go about doing that?
So I don't think most of the journalists hide their identities, because in the case of photographers, sometimes we got a website or stuff like that. my phone number is public and stuff like that. But when when you're in the field, you gotta have like a low profile. You're not going into a narco area being like, oh, yo, I got a camera. That's gonna be a bad idea. So you gotta be kind of careful with that. And once your work is published, it's like flipping a coin. It could be dangerous for you. You might be start to get death threats or stuff like that, or not. And we certainly have some protocols developed, especially for Mexico, also for other places. But Mexico's protocols are really specific, like as Ginger mentioned, like to check in with somebody like once in a while or a certain amount of hours later. There are like panic buttons or stuff like that that I found really useless. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, no, I don't ever really hide my identity. In fact, I think the times I have run into people who might have wanted to do me harm, when they hear that I'm a reporter, it changes things. And I do believe that American reporters in Mexico operate with a lot more safety than Mexican reporters, right? My Mexican colleagues, if they had had the same run-ins that I've had, might not be here. I think the fact that I'm able to sort of say, I'm an American reporter and I'm here just sort of doing a story has saved me a couple of times. So.
I do have friends who, in some places, have gone undercover, like pretending they're priests, or they sell makeup with someone or something.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
There's one right there. Right there. Just turn there.
Hey, sorry about my English. I'm not from here. Was it a coincidence that journalists got like the symbol of being against the democracy, and the cartels? Do they really have any interest of hiding these stories? I don't know if you got it.
Does who have interest in hiding the stories?
Like the cartels.
I think it depends a lot of the media, the platforms, and the stories that you're telling. Because sometimes if you publish like in a local media, it might be dangerous for you if you live in the area, in the state. If you're telling the story of how this drug lord is linked with this municipal governor or president, whatever, you're going to be in trouble, And the thing is that the organized crime and the government in Mexico, in many levels, in many layers, are deeply, deeply linked. So you might be telling a story of the governor, but the cartels are going to be the ones who send you the threats. Or you might be telling the story of this drug lord, killing peasants or something like that, to have more field to harvest like marijuana or poppy or something like that. And it's going to be the police of the state police, of the municipal police, who tells you, you know what? Easy, my friend. So it really depends it can be really ambiguous, I think.
I agree, and I think it depends on what the people you're writing about want to accomplish. So if you're writing about a country that has like very high levels of violence, and the president really wants to portray a peaceful, economically growing country with a lot of trying to attract a lot of foreign investment, that's going to piss the government off. But if you are in a municipality where there's two cartels fighting over that turf, and you write that one of the kingpins of one of the cartels was arrested, and that makes them look weak before the other one, that's gonna make the cartel be pissed off. So it depends. I think it depends on what you're writing about and how it affects those you're writing about.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Maybe in the back there.
Hi, my name is Amber. I'm a student at NYU, and I was wondering what your opinions on like American television and culture relating to violence in Mexico, like shows like Narcos or Breaking Bad. Like, are they helpful in spreading the word, or are they inaccurate, or are they just exploitation?
Oh, that's a tough one. So, I hate them. Yeah, I just like to be clear. Because you can't tell that kind of stories in such a way. This is not a telenovela. You know what I mean? Even movies. You know, I love Denis Villeneuve, and movies he directs. And I think Sicario was a good movie in terms of in cinematic terms. But no matter if we're talking about Netflix's Narcos series or Sicario's movies, we can't tell the stories that way because that's not the way they happen. It's that easy. So people think it's, it seems that it's cool to be a narco, I would like to live that life. And it makes us look kind of silly, I think, because we're trying to tell these stories in a really particular way through our words, through our visuals, through our investigations. So I think that the approach that we need has to be really different and deeper.
Just quickly, I kind of disagree. I think there's a enormous range of variety in these productions. So none of them are the same, and I cannot speak for all of them. But I do think that some of them might attempt to understand the human nature of how people get involved in this. And I do think that some people in some places of Mexico, under a very specific set of circumstances, do think that being a narco is cool. And I think that understanding those initial incentives or the reality in which some people live and the humanity that everyone has involved in this, I think there's some merits in that. Whether these productions accomplish that or not, I'm not sure, but I appreciate some of them.
All right. Well, there's a sign telling us to wrap up, so we'll do that. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you.